reach across time and see yourself. You stand tall against terrifying enemies. You build masterpieces and break down barriers. You rush into the future and meet your past. For every time, at every moment, the official network of every millennium. The History Channel, where the past comes alive.
They ushered in a new era of politics, carrying heads of state deep into the nation's heartland. They were vehicles of hope and somber processions of death and despair. And they sometimes served as the White House on wheels. Presidential trains. Modern age, Air Force One, the sleek and ultra-sophisticated 747, is the symbol of the president on the move. But 150 years ago, when the nation was young, U.S. presidents traveled the way the rest of the country did, by train.
Well, as you turn the pages of history, there's no doubt whatsoever, trains brought the country together. It was the most practical way to go from the East Coast to the West Coast for many, many, many years. So as you read about American history and our expansion westward beyond the Mississippi and over the Rocky Mountains, you can't help but read the history of railroads in this country.
The man who set the wheels of the presidential train in motion was Andrew Jackson. On June 6, 1833, Old Hickory became the first president to ride a train, traveling from Ellicott's Mills, Maryland to Baltimore. The 13-mile trip took less than a half an hour, dazzling speed for the time.
He wrote about that trip to his son, and he didn't call it a railroad train or a passenger train, he called it the steam cars. And he spelled it C-A-R-R-S. And he said, we made it to Baltimore at 2:30 p.m. without fatigue or injury. But that was the first ride of a sitting president in the United States.
In 1849, President-elect Zachary Taylor embarked on one of the most complicated and varied journeys to the capital the nation had ever seen. From his plantation in Louisiana, Taylor traveled by riverboat on the Mississippi and Ohio rivers to Wheeling, West Virginia. He then took a stagecoach to Uniontown, Pennsylvania. Next, he rode a horse through the Allegheny Mountains to Cumberland, Maryland, where he caught a train on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad that delivered him to Washington. The crowds loved it, and the image of a U.S. president riding a train to victory was etched in the people's minds. But riding the rails in the mid-1800s could be treacherous. In 1853, tragedy struck President-elect Franklin Pierce. Shortly before he took office, Pierce was traveling with his wife Jane and their 12-year-old son Benjamin on the Boston and Maine Railroad. Suddenly, the train coach overturned and plunged down a 20-foot precipice.
It was a wooden car, of course, and it just shattered. And the young son, Pierce's son Benny, was pinned by one of the support beams that held the car together, and he was killed. And that always cast a pall over the whole Pierce presidency. There was no joy in the executive mansion, of course, and It was just a sad way to start a presidential term.
Pierce's successor, James Buchanan, rode the B&O Railroad to his inauguration in 1857. There were cheerful celebrations for the new president, but the tensions of an impending civil war dampened spirits. After Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the country was perilously close to war. 7 states from the Deep South seceded and formed the Confederacy. Slavery was the issue. Abolitionists and slaves had a champion in the man from Springfield. But Lincoln's paramount objective was to save the Union. Presidential trains would serve this cause. An extensive railroad trip was planned to carry the president-elect to Washington. On February the 11th, 1861, Mr. Lincoln left his home in Springfield, Illinois, for the last time. He stood on the back of his train and openly wept as he bid his neighbors and friends farewell. The journey required 12 days and the services of 23 railroads. Lincoln used the occasion to speak to the American citizens. He urged them to keep their animosities in check and to work for peace and unification. It was the first time the presidential train brought politics directly to the people.
The trip was purposely circuitous in order to bring Lincoln to the public in the broadest sense, in the broadest way. So it took quite a while to get from Illinois to Washington, but it sort of set the tone for his presidency of bringing the nation together.
Along the route, there were rumors of more than one plot to assassinate the newly elected president. The Secret Service did not yet exist. Railroad detective Allen Pinkerton was assigned to protect Lincoln's life. Pinkerton prevailed upon Lincoln to enter Washington via an alternate route through Baltimore and to alter his appearance.
Then, in a disguise, in a floppy hat, not anything like the top hat that he wore most of the time, and a shawl wrapped around him, Lincoln was able to get on the train unnoticed, and he passed Baltimore successfully.
At daybreak, February 23, 1861, Lincoln arrived in the capital on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The president-elect was safe. In his inaugural address, the president called for peace. But on April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter. The Great Civil War began. Lincoln was the first president to use a train for military purposes.
He did use it on a number of occasions to go out to the battlefield areas, to visit the troops, to visit his commanders.
On November 18, 1863, the president left Washington by train to attend the consecration of the National Soldier Cemetery at Gettysburg. 5 months had passed since that cruel and bloody battle in Pennsylvania.
One of the most notable of all of his uses of the train was the trip he took to Gettysburg. And in fact, it's said that he put the finishing touches on the famous Gettysburg Address while en route to Gettysburg on the train.
Lincoln continued to use the train as the war entered its 4th year. On March 24, 1865, he visited a battle site near City Point, Virginia. The Union forces had been victorious. The president left his train and rode on horseback through the carnage of the battle. Lincoln returned to his train saying he had seen enough of the horrors of war. He hoped that this was the beginning of the end of the conflict. It was. The war ended that spring. Lincoln had prevailed and the Union was saved. But the president had one final train trip to go. April 14, 1865, President Lincoln lay mortally wounded, the victim of an assassin's bullet. With Lincoln's death, the tradition of the formal presidential funeral train was established. A nation still reeling from the devastating effects of the Civil War now mourned the loss of its leader. The presidential car carried Lincoln's body and the remains of his son Willie, who had died 3 years earlier. The plush furniture of the conference room was removed, replaced by a catafalque, which supported the president's silver-lined casket. Willie's coffin rested at the foot of his father's bier. The black-draped funeral train carried the body of the fallen president to his final resting place in Springfield, Illinois. The train traveled almost the same route Lincoln had traveled to the Capitol a little more than 4 years earlier.
The loss of the president at the same time that the Great War was ending obviously had a tremendous impact upon the people of the United States. And I think that maybe that train and bringing the people out and paying their respects started the healing process within this country as far as the people are concerned at the time of at the end of a very, very difficult period.
The funeral train then continued its slow, solemn journey through the heartland to the president's hometown. Along the route, people placed flowers on the tracks and stood in silence with their heads bowed. They paid their final respects to a man who had won the war, restored the peace, and saved the Union. By the time the train reached Springfield, it had traveled 1,662 miles. It was estimated that more than 1 million mourners viewed the body of the fallen president.
I've read about the train taking President Lincoln's body back to Illinois. It was probably the most dramatic use of a train by a president or a deceased president. That was a memorable but sad experience in the way a train was used.
Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, faced the daunting challenge of rebuilding the war-torn nation.
Andrew Johnson used the train in 1866 during a midterm election to make a swing around the circle, to visit the most populated areas of the country, to stop in one town after another and make his case known to the people. The only thing is, it didn't work too well for him because people would argue with him with his points of view, and he would get mad at him. He would strike back and yell at them just as loud as they yelled at him.
The next president, Ulysses S. Grant, was unfazed by his predecessor's mistakes. Grant loved the train. He rode in a custom-designed sleeper equipped with black walnut woodwork and plush French upholstery. Grant traveled so widely into the Wild West that Congress reprimanded him for being away from Washington so often.
Grant countered the argument by observing that by going out west and seeing his constituents and his voters out west, that he was doing something important for keeping the nation as a single political enterprise, especially after the trauma of the Civil War.
When Rutherford B. Hayes took office, the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed. In 1877, Hayes became the first president to travel the full breadth of the country by train. The trip was designed to promote goodwill for the Republican Party. The cross-country jaunt took 71 days to complete. Hayes' successor, James Garfield, is probably best known for the trip he never made. In 1881, Garfield was due to take a train out of the Baltimore and Potomac Station in Washington. He was walking through the waiting room when a deranged, self-styled patriot named Charles Guiteau rushed up and shot him in the back. A bereaved nation prayed for the president's recovery, but to no avail. On September 19, 1881, 80 days after he was shot, James Garfield died. A draped funeral train carried his body home to Cleveland, Ohio.
The funeral train was something that occurred on very short notice and took a tremendous coordination between the railroads and the administration to carry out and to properly execute the movement of a funeral train. Usually draped in black crepe with hand-picked crews for not only presidential trains, but for the funeral train.
5 years later, Grover Cleveland became the first and only president to be married in the White House. On May 28, 1886, Cleveland stunned the nation when he announced his engagement to the beautiful and well-educated Frances Folsom. She was 21 years old. He was 49. The ceremony was held in the Executive Mansion's Blue Room. When it was over, the newlyweds slipped away, boarded the private presidential railroad car, Maryland, and rode off into the night.
One of President Grover Cleveland's trips was unique in the presidency in that he took his honeymoon aboard a train following his marriage to a much younger woman, and they took their honeymoon trip up to Deer Park, Maryland on the B&O Railroad. Raised a few eyebrows at the time in his constituency, but I imagine a lot of people were somewhat envious of President Cleveland.
The press tailed the wedding party to the honeymoon cottage in Deer Park. Reporters hid in the nearby bushes with spy glasses, then sent stories back to their newspapers by telegraph.
They didn't have much direct contact with Cleveland, but they were always watching and noticing what kind of clothing they had on when they came out of the cottage and what they did on the grounds of the mountainside they were staying on. And they would even, as the hotel would bring the covered dishes to their cottage, they would actually lift the lid off the dishes to see what they were going to eat.
A survey later reported that most Americans found the antics of this early-day version of the paparazzi detestable. But for the most part, the press would work hand in hand with the presidents and presidential hopefuls as they took their ideas to the people by train. It was 1900, the turn of the century. The race for the presidency was now being run on the rails. Incumbent President William McKinley and his opponent, William Jennings Bryan, made tracks across the country in search of votes.
In the last century, when people weren't seeing the president on TV every night or reading about him in the news magazines every week, the arrival of the president in town by train was a remarkable event and something that people, I'm sure, remembered for a long, long time after that event. And it was the way the president got out to get a feel of what was going on out in the country.
Throughout his campaign, President McKinley, quiet by nature, sent his colorful running mate Theodore Roosevelt on extended trips by rail to rally the people. Teddy loved to talk.
When he was campaigning on the McKinley ticket in 1900, he went everywhere by train. And people just loved him. He traveled thousands of miles and delivered hundreds of speeches. And that seemed to suit his personality. He was a rugged man, outdoors type, a hunter. And the rougher you handled him, the better he liked it.
McKinley won the election handily, but his term was cut short by tragedy. In 1901, at the end of a railroad tour of the United States, the president and his wife attended the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. President McKinley was greeting admirers at a reception at the Temple of Music when an anarchist named Leon Jogosh approached him with a revolver concealed under a handkerchief. The assassin fired 2 bullets into the smiling president. William McKinley lingered for 8 days, then died. Thousands stood in mourning as a somber funeral train returned the president's body to Washington and then on to Ohio for burial. Among the mourners was the new President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, who rode the train to McKinley's funeral.
Teddy Roosevelt used the train to a great extent, not only for travel, but also for campaigning. And there are some great photographs of President Teddy Roosevelt during his campaign trips taken around the country from the platform of cars very similar to this car that we are on today.
Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to have an entire train at his disposal. It was known as a POTUS train.
The term POTUS, P-O-T-U-S, stands for President of the United States, and came from kind of a telegraph shorthand to be able to describe that this was indeed the train of the president.
Teddy Roosevelt's trips to the heartland earned him a tremendous national following. President William Howard Taft, who followed Teddy Roosevelt into the White House, was a large man with a large appetite. He loved to travel by train, and he loved to eat. His wife, Nellie, put her husband on a strict diet, which he followed religiously when she was around. Once the president was on a train to Ohio, and Nellie wasn't. He requested a late-night snack. He was told that the train had no dining car. According to reports, Taft's face turned red, then purple, and finally, he exploded with anger.
And he said, "I am the President of the United States, and I want a dining car on this train, and I want it filled with all manner of food and beverage, especially steaks. And where is the earliest point that can take place?" And the conductor said, "Well, Harrisburg." So he said, "What's the use of being the President of the United States if you can't have a diner on your train?" So he used his influence to coerce the Pennsylvania Railroad into putting a diner on the train in the middle of the night at Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And he invited all of the press people aboard to come back and eat with him in the diner. And here they are having steak dinners at 2 o'clock in the morning.
But presidential trains served noble causes as well. After the country emerged from the horrors of World War I, President Woodrow Wilson called for the United States to join a League of Nations that would assure world peace in the future. The Senate rejected the proposal. To keep his dream alive and to rally popular support, Wilson began an exhaustive speaking tour of the country. He traveled by train.
I think we can look certainly at almost every president in the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century used the train in key ways to get his message directly to the public in a way that could not be done by then newspapers or even later on by radio.
Aboard the designated presidential car, Mayflower, President Wilson sat at his typewriter and worked day and night, honing his platform speeches. Wilson's wife, Edith, worried about his fragile health, but he pushed on.
He became very emotional before this trip was over with. And he gave a speech in Pueblo, Colorado, in which he actually cried during the delivery of it. And it just looked like he was falling apart. He missed a step. He had to be helped up to the podium and all that. And it was that night that he had his stroke on the train, and all the stops from there on back to Washington were canceled. The U.S. did not choose to join the League of Nations, and Wilson's great dream for this nation evaporated.
In 1923, the railroad played another significant role in the fate of a U.S. president. That summer, Warren Harding accepted an invitation to drive the last spike in the Alaska Railroad. It was to be his last official ceremony. The president developed bronchial pneumonia in Alaska and returned as quickly as possible to San Francisco. On the evening of August 2nd, 1923, Harding was resting in bed. His wife Florence was nearby reading to him. Suddenly, he shuddered and fell back onto his pillows. Warren Harding was dead. Various railroads from the Southern Pacific to the B&O carried the funeral train as it slowly crossed from west to east.
President Harding's funeral train really came all the way across the United States for the service in Washington, and then was run as a separate special train to take the body back to Ohio. President Harding's trip was probably close to 4,000 miles as a funeral train.
6 years later, in 1929, the stock market crashed, and the nation plunged headlong into the Great Depression. The 1932 presidential campaign ushered in the golden era of campaign trains, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and incumbent President Herbert Hoover on a collision course. In 1932, as the country wasted in the depths of the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the incumbent President Herbert Hoover crisscrossed the nation by rail, seeking the votes of the people. Both men had difficulties. Hoover was blamed for the Depression. One trackside heckler shouted to Hoover, "Why don't you vote for Roosevelt and make it unanimous?" Roosevelt's problems were physical. He had been afflicted with polio, which completely paralyzed both of his legs.
One of the concerns I'm sure Roosevelt and the Democratic Party had was that the public would feel that his handicap in some way would impede his ability to be an effective president.
Roosevelt was determined to erase these concerns. He set out on an arduous campaign tour by train that traveled over 13,000 miles in 4 months.
Roosevelt made the train work for him. He had these very heavy leg braces, and it was very, of course, difficult for him to get around. But when he was on the back platform and he was holding on to a grab iron or the railing and just standing there erect, he presented himself to the world as a leader who was strong and bold and courageous and smart and all the rest of it, and he really looked the part of a president.
Roosevelt won by a stunning plurality in 1932, and in his subsequent 3 campaigns for re-election, always traveled by train.
I'd known for years of FDR's love of trains. He traveled whenever he could across the country. He loved trains almost as much as he loved being at sea on a ship.
When the United States entered World War II in 1941, FDR's use of the train changed dramatically, as it included secret trips to highly classified installations. Presidents for years had traveled in private cars, such as the Ferdinand Magellan, built by the Pullman Company. But in 1941, sabotage was a real threat, so the car was rebuilt to protect the president during wartime travel.
One of the modifications that was done to the car when it was rebuilt for the president was the adding of heavier steel on the sides of the car. Normally it's about a 1/4 of an inch or less. They moved that up to 5/8 inch steel. And this carries all the way from the area in which the president would normally be found all the way to the end of the car. Another feature that was added to the car was the addition of very thick glass, laminated in layers of 12 individual panes, which came out to about 3 inches thick. This afforded the president a good bit of protection against bullets, rocks, whatever the possibilities might be that might be thrown against the car.
Roosevelt only requested that the Magellan be made a bit more comfortable.
When the car was taken out of regular charter service for conversion into a presidential Pullman car, One of the things they did was reduce the number of bedrooms on board. Normally there'd be 5, there now are 4. This afforded them a larger area for the dining room and a larger area for the lounge area at the rear of the car.
Franklin Roosevelt used the dining and lounge areas with great pleasure. He may not have had the appetite of William Howard Taft, but he definitely had gourmet tastes. At the end of the day, FDR often relaxed with a game of solitaire as he traveled under wartime conditions.
My first experience in riding in a presidential train was with President Roosevelt in October of 1944. I was then a Naval Reserve officer working in what was called the map room. We handled all of FDR's correspondence and cables with Churchill, with Stalin, with Chang. We had all his war plans. So he took me with him to Hyde Park. So I found myself as the only other passenger in the Ferdinand Magellan with FDR that night. He boarded soon after I did, and his first question is, what will you have to drink? After we'd solved that pleasantry, he went to bed, and so did I.
Here in the presidential bedroom, we see the famous presidential bed, and on the wall behind, you see the bar attached. This was such that FDR could hoist himself up out of bed without additional help, swing himself around, and use the facilities within the bedroom.
A tiny wheelchair was custom designed for FDR so that he could navigate the narrow passages of the Ferdinand Magellan. Throughout the war, Roosevelt visited military facilities and made frequent trips to meet with other world leaders. Throughout his presidency, FDR made 399 trips by rail and traveled 243,827 miles, equivalent to 10 times around the world.
President Roosevelt probably utilized the train, the passenger train, whether it was for campaigns or for travel or to transact business throughout America more than any other president. It was a difficult period in American history, but the train played a key role with the presidency at that point.
By March of 1945, FDR was drained, a frail shadow of his former self. To gain a brief rest, he planned a train trip to the Little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia.
I guess I was just about the last person at the White House to see FDR before he went to Warm Springs. I was at work at my desk in what was then and still is the library on the ground floor of the White House. And the president was wheeled in to select some books to just take for light reading on the train and in Warm Springs. And when I said goodbye to him on his way down, I did not realize that, of course, that was the last time I would see the president alive.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed away on April 12, 1945. He was sitting in his leather chair in the Little White House when he slumped over. 2 hours later, at 3:15 in the afternoon, he died of a massive brain hemorrhage. His body was returned to Washington by train. In the presidential car, Mrs. Roosevelt recalled Millard Lampell's musical poem, The Lonesome Train. A lonesome train on a lonesome track. 7 coaches painted black. A slow train, a quiet train, carrying Lincoln home again. This train carried the body of her husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The heavy mantle of leadership fell on the shoulders of the Vice President, Harry S. Truman. He carried a look of grave concern as he boarded the funeral train. Harry Truman took his new responsibilities without flinching. He was tougher than anyone suspected, and he brought the war to a sudden end.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
By this time, Harry Truman decided he liked his job and wanted a term of his own. But in 1948, he was running for his political life. All the polls were predicting victory for Thomas E. Dewey and the Republicans. Undaunted, Harry Truman decided to take his case to the people. He believed there was no better way to do it than from the rear platform of the Ferdinand Magellan. And so began one of the most memorable contests for the presidency of the United States, the Great Whistle Stop Campaign of 1948. Harry Truman was in trouble, and he knew it. In the summer of 1948, the polls predicted defeat for the president in the fall election.
Ask your support.
Thomas Dewey, governor of New York, would win, so said the soothsayers of political fortunes. President Truman decided to take his show on the road and present his case personally to the common man.
I do recall very vividly the campaign that Harry Truman undertook in 1948 when he campaigned extensively by train. I happen to think that that kind of campaigning by Harry Truman was a significant factor in his election over Tom Dewey in 1948.
A monumental trip was planned. Harry Truman would speak at hundreds of cities and small towns. The Republicans jeeringly referred to his trip as whistle station stops, implying that he was visiting little towns of no importance.
Originally, the term whistle stop referred to a small, out-of-the-way station where not very many people got on or off the trains.
Truman liked the term, and it became known as the Whistle Stop Campaign of 1948. The train whistle was a signal to the people to come on down to the station and listen to Harry give 'em hell.
It was the party of the people under Wilson and
The
Franklin
president would
Roosevelt.
speak sometimes as many as 15 times a day from the rear platform to crowds which grew increasingly larger and larger and larger as the campaign went on. Truman had a very hard-hitting campaign style in contrast to Dewey's soft-spoken, mellifluous platitudes, which really got no public attention at all.
As election day approached, Truman kept campaigning hard on the issues, different issues at every stop. One day, the presidential train was in Minnesota on its way to the Twin Cities. There were a few hours to go, and President Truman was trying to relax.
I sat with him across the dining table in the Ferdinand Magellan, going over some outlines of future talks. And he said, "Oh, enough of this. Take your pencil and paper." And he began rattling off the names of the states: Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, going through all 48, giving the electoral votes of each state. And when we got through, he said, "How many do I have?" And I did some quick arithmetic and said, "You've got 340, Mr. President." Harry Truman knew from the very beginning that he was going to win that campaign, and he did.
It is said that Thomas Dewey went to bed believing he had been elected president. The Chicago Tribune printed a headline which was one of the biggest journalistic bungles of the 20th century. President Truman took great delight in holding up the paper to the roar of laughter and applause from the crowd.
I think that Harry Truman was down to earth as a person. Tom Dewey was a very successful prosecutor of the criminal element in the New York State. Very brilliant mind, but he didn't have the common touch. So Harry Truman's campaign by train with his down-to-earth common touch was very effective in his winning that election.
Dwight Eisenhower used the train very effectively during his 1952 bid for the presidency. Ike employed the whistle-stop techniques of Harry Truman. At one stop in Michigan, he picked up a young congressman and his wife.
I first met President Eisenhower in 1952 when he was campaigning for the presidency. And of course, it was a thrill for me and for my wife, Betty, to meet the Eisenhowers and be with them for probably an hour or two as the train went from Holland to the next station.
Ike served 2 terms and was one of America's most popular presidents. He died at Walter Reed Hospital on March 28, 1969. He had been out of office for almost 10 years. A private military funeral train plan was put into effect.
I was aboard this train. As we approached Cincinnati, the Eisenhower family realized that it now had become a public event and that something needed to be done to acknowledge that.
Ike's body, according to his final wishes, was being carried in the baggage car as a common soldier. Mrs. Eisenhower had black bunting and an American flag placed on either side of the car so that people would know it held the president. And in this manner, the train arrived in Abilene. Dwight Eisenhower's journey was over, and the people had shared the experience.
If you want to do something to endure a former president's heritage following his death, the use of a train to take the body from Washington to his home is by far the better way to do it.
Years later, after he had become the 38th President of the United States, Gerald Ford used the train to campaign against Ronald Reagan in the Michigan primary of 1976. President Ford began to discover firsthand what presidents of the past had learned from the back platform of their campaign trains.
I know from my experience, even in my own state of Michigan, where we went from Flint to the southwestern corner of the state, probably 300 miles, took most of the day, where we stopped probably 10 times. And in each occasion, you had a different crowd, a different atmosphere. You can't do that with an aircraft.
Every modern president, from John F. Kennedy to Bill Clinton, has used the train to some extent. In 1984, Ronald Reagan brought the Ferdinand Magellan out of retirement for a brief whistle stop while campaigning for a second term.
This may gall our opponents.
George Bush campaigned into the heartland on a special POTUS train in his bid to win re-election in 1992.
I was contacted by one of the railroads in which the POTUS train was going to be used over their lines. They needed another car as a support car for the train, and by that I mean this car was not the rear car that President Bush spoke from, but it was the second car from him, and it was a support car that housed the Secret Service and communications.
But in President Clinton's campaign of 1996, the Georgia 300 moved to the coveted rear position and became the presidential car, complete with a presidential chef.
I cooked for President Clinton for 4 days. We picked him up in Huntington, West Virginia, and there we took the 21st century tour.
One day, President Clinton paid a visit to the kitchen of the Georgia 300.
My back was turned one afternoon, and I heard a voice behind me say, "What's for dinner?" So I was busy then making the sauce. And so I said, "I'll take care of you after I take care of the president." So then I look around, and I jumped like that. And he smiled and shook my hand. So he went on through the car.
We're on the right track. We're moving in the right direction. Thank you, and God bless you.
As we travel into the 21st century, the presidential train may slow down, but hopefully it will not disappear. The sound of the train's whistle, the marching band, and the cheering citizens were the sounds of small-town America at its best.
there's something about the trains that is attractive to the American people. And for the president to use the trains really, I guess it maybe brings back a sense of the history of the presidents, that's all, their only mode of travel was by train.
The exhilaration of stopping at a relatively small community and you and your wife going on the end of the train and having somebody locally introduce you, and you then introduce your wife, and then you make a few remarks. You can't do that on Air Force One.
The image of the president addressing an enthusiastic crowd gathered at the station may one day be relegated to the pages of railroad history. But the feelings evoked by these special events will endure forever.